Thank you for joining. We're going to talk about a couple of things today. First, with Whit Ayres and Mark Mellman, some questions about polling, particularly what Mark Mellman wrote about. I hope you all had a chance to read his column, and I recommend you the column to you as a general matter. It runs in the Hill, but Mark wrote about how some people are analyzing both the results of the primaries and caucuses and some of the exit poll data and entrant poll data to make statements and projections about the general election that he quite rightly points out, in my view, are a big mistake. And there's one in particular that we're going to talk about that relates to this question of Donald Trump's failure to get 100% of the vote in these primaries, and how some people are reading into that. And then we'll talk to them about that. I will talk a little bit about a poll that's out today, or a series of polls that are out today from some of the battleground states. And then we're going to talk about the Supreme Court's ruling or decision yesterday to take kind of the intermediate path, not rejecting the Trump immunity case from the Court of Appeals, not accepting it on a normal schedule, which would mean they wouldn't have taken it up to schedule arguments relatively quickly. But in taking the middle path, they've made a pretty big decision in the view of most legal and political analysts about whether the DC case can actually happen, to go to a jury before the election. And overnight, although you don't see this in much of the news coverage, on Twitter and elsewhere, you're now hearing from some Democrats who believe that this is not just a kind of a administrative decision by the court, but rather something that is dangerous. And in the view of one Democrat I saw say that he said he woke up nauseous thinking about the corruption at the heart of yesterday's Supreme Court decision. So the question of whether there's corruption there, real or imagined, is something I want to talk about when we get to that part of our conversation, because make no mistake, what the Supreme Court did yesterday was momentous in the context of the potential of the Trump legal matters to influence the election. And we'll talk about that. But first, I look again to see Mark Mellman. Have you joined us? Mark Mellman there. All right. While we track down Mark, because it's his column that has convened us to a large extent, I want to ask Dr. Ayres, who is here. There's Mark Mellman. I see him now. Mark, I do. Mark, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you both. And Mark, I'm going to kick it to you in a moment to ask you to talk about your column and one point in particular. But I just want to say, a lot of pollsters in America. We have today two of the best. Whit Ayres is a Republican pollster. Mark is a Democratic pollster. They work for great clients. They're honest with their clients. They're rigorous about their methodology. They're willing to speak truth to power, even if it's not the most pleasant thing for their own party, both publicly and privately. And we couldn't have two better people to talk about these issues in the whole country, as far as I'm concerned, than the two of them. So thank you for joining. Mark, I don't know if you joined or not when I recommended not only this column, but your column regularly. It's one of the smartest things I think people can read about polling. Mark, I'd love for you to just summarize your column. And the point I want you to start with is this issue of why it might be that Haley voters, as they go to the polls to vote for Nikki Haley, might not say that they'd be open to voting for Donald Trump in the fall.
Well, what we know from history is that poll questions that ask people to project themselves into some alternative universe and predict their behavior in that alternative universe just don't work out very well. We know that, frankly, from the Clinton impeachment, to which I was totally opposed. But the reality is, if we look at the poll questions that were asked then, people said, well, if Clinton lied, should he be impeached? And people said yes. And then when it was clear that he had lied, people were asked, should he be impeached? And they said, no, absolutely not. And then they said, well, if he is impeached, should he resign or should he fight the impeachment? People said, oh, he should resign. And then when he was impeached, people said, no, he should not resign. He should stay in office. People's predictions about how they would react to these events were just way off. And we saw the same thing, in 2016 with Barack Obama. NBC Wall Street Journal poll, fine poll, but asked people if Republican primary voters, if they would vote for Trump were he the nominee. And almost half, 47% of women who had voted in the Republican primary said they would not vote for Donald Trump. But in fact, 88% of Republican women did vote for Donald Trump. that was just 1 point less than Republican men. So the reality is these questions just do not do a good job at telling us whether or not how people are going to behave in the future in this alternative universe. If Donald Trump is the nominee, and of course we all assume he will be, if he's the nominee, the vast majority of Republicans are going to vote for him, including those people that participated in the primary process. Not everyone, but the vast majority of them.
Yeah, and Whit, I want you to weigh in on what Mark just said, and whether you agree or not, or disagree with any nuance. But again, as Mark points out in the column, someone going to the polls to vote for Nikki Haley is going to be at a moment where maybe they're not in touch with their future behavior of how they might vote in the general election. On the day they're voting for Nikki Haley, they're unlikely to say, "Oh, of course, I'll flip around in a few months and vote for Donald Trump." Whit, just love your overall view of Mark's thesis on that point.
In broad outline, Mark, I agree with Dr. Mellman, as I usually do when we're looking at the same set of data, that you can tell relatively little about how a state is going to perform in a general election by looking at the primary results. That's particularly true of a Democratic candidate running in a red state like Joe Biden in South Carolina in 2020. He swept the Democratic primary, but had absolutely no chance in the general election. It's also true of Republican candidates running in Republican primaries in primarily blue states. There's another aspect of these exit polls that I think is misleading, along the lines of what Mark was saying. Would you vote for Donald Trump if he were convicted of a felony in the fall? And you got in Iowa, 31% of the GOP caucus goers said no, they would not. In New Hampshire, it was up to 47% of the GOP primary voters. And in South Carolina, it was 36%. But that's not really the right question, if he's fit for office or not. Because what if they think the alternative, Joe Biden, is unfit for office too, because he's too damn old to be running again? And so you face these voters with a choice of two people, both of whom they consider unfit. And so it's a mistake to assume that just because you think that Donald Trump would be unfit if he's convicted, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote against him. On the other hand, I do think there's some hints we can look at from primary results that may give us an idea of problems for that candidate in the fall. Donald Trump won 46% of independent voters nationally when he beat Hillary Clinton in 2016, but he only won 41% of independents in 2020 when he lost to Joe Biden. In New Hampshire, 39% of the undeclareds, which is what they call the independents there, voted for Nikki Haley. In South Carolina, 37% of the independents 39% of the independents in New Hampshire voted for Trump. And in South Carolina, only 37% of the independents voted for Trump. So if he needs 45, 46% nationally to win, is that an indication that he might have some problems with independents who would go vote in a Republican primary, which you would think would be sort of independents leaning toward Republicans? So I think that may be an indication of some problems with independents in the fall. But in large part, I agree with Mark's argument.
Right. So, Mark, the example I've been thinking about is 2016 Sanders Clinton, where you saw lots of Sanders supporters who voted against her, voted for him, say they'd never vote for her. They some of them very visibly held out through the convention at least, and clearly some Sanders supporters either voted for Trump or didn't vote at all. So we don't want to overread your very important point that you can't say Trump can't win these people over, but is it possible that I think what Whit was suggesting, that independents in particular, that these results and exit polls may be showing a real vulnerability for Trump with that group that he'll need some of to win?
Well, the answer is they may be, but the may is the important word to underline there. We don't really know if they are or not. If you look at the demographics, I mean, Hillary Clinton lost young people to Bernie Sanders in that race by a huge margin. People said, oh, she's got a weakness among young people. In the general election, she won overwhelmingly among young people. And you can look at other such demographics and see the same kind of inconsistency. So, yes, it's quite possible that Trump has some weaknesses among independents, and we see that in lots of different ways, frankly. But we can't be sure that what we see because it's a primary, that's a more telling indicator than just a regular set of polls that one might look at and see the problem in the horse race. So bottom line is, yes, the primaries may tell us something, but we can't count on what we think they're telling us as true.
Mark, there's one other statistic that we might keep in mind. The overall turnout in primaries nationally is generally less than half what it is in general elections. And in some states like South Carolina, 4 times as many people voted in the 2020 general election in South Carolina than voted in both party primaries. So we're talking about a small subset of the general election electorate who actually turns out to vote in primaries.
Exactly. And I would argue, honestly, that independents are independents, and that's an important group to look at. But the biggest difference between people who vote in a primary is that they chose to vote in a partisan primary. And those people are different than people who chose not to vote in a partisan primary. And if you're an independent who voted in the Republican primary, you are different from the independents who didn't choose to vote in the partisan primary. So again, the people that you're looking at in the primary are different, much smaller subset, and different in some important ways politically from the people who chose not to vote in that primary.
Correct.
Right. Hugely important point. We're going to go to your questions in a moment. So if you have a question, you're going to raise your electronic hand. I want to ask each of you one more Trump question, and then I want to ask you both a Biden, Michigan question, meaning Mark and Whit, and conscious of the fact that one of President Trump's pollsters is part of the conversation today, who joined as one of our community members. So just keep that in mind as you talk, if you'd like. Mark first, and then Whit. What if you were looking from Donald Trump's perspectives on this question of vulnerability with independents, which again, many people in Biden world would say that's the whole election, that Donald Trump's going to have a ceiling with independents in the end over abortion, democracy, and other issues. What would you see in either the results or the exit polls, again, Mark and then Whit, that would give you concern if you were in the Trump camp about where he stands with independents?
Well, again, I wouldn't be focused so much on the primary results, but I think if you look at all the polling that's out there, first of all, you do see that Trump does appear to have a ceiling. Now, can he go above that ceiling? Yes, but there are no polls that have him above 44, 45% of the vote. He just doesn't get much more than that, number one. Number two, he does have a clear problem with independents. And with other segments of the electorate, he's out of sync with people on a whole lot of issues. And the truth is, while there are a lot of people who don't like the job that President Biden is doing, there are a whole lot of people who don't like Donald Trump. And so the people who are really going to decide this election are the people who are hostile to both of these candidates at some level.
Whit.
If Joe Biden had been stronger, I think Nikki Haley would have done relatively better than she did. The fact is that 3/4 of the country thinks we're going the wrong direction. A majority of the country disapproves of Biden's job performance. And fully 86% of Americans think he's too old to run again. I mean, 86% of Americans don't agree on anything except the fact that Joe Biden is too old. That undercut Nikki Haley's strongest argument, which is, I can beat Joe Biden and Donald Trump can't. Because as we got closer to these primaries, Donald Trump was beating Joe Biden in all the swing states and would actually win an electoral college landslide in the electoral college, not the popular vote, but the electoral college, if the election were held today. That really sapped Nikki Haley of the key argument that she was making when she got into this race, that she was stronger than Trump to beat Biden. She's still stronger than Trump, but if Trump can beat Biden, it took a lot of wind out of her sails.
Great. I want to show you a graphic, folks, if you could put the graphic up. Mark, you mentioned this notion of a Trump ceiling. And it's certainly, again, if you talk to people in Biden world, it's the thing they mention maybe most of all, that particularly if there's not a large vote that goes to say other candidates besides the two major party candidates, that in all likelihood, Trump simply can't get enough popular vote in nationally and in the battleground states to win. Folks, can you put up the graphic that we talked about? I don't know, Mel, if you can do that, share the screen and put that up in just a second. I look at the battleground data, which has been remarkably consistent. In fact, the polling in general this cycle has been extremely consistent in my sense of things, including the battleground state polls. New set of polls out in the 7 states that are likely to decide the election. Maybe you think it's 6, but they polled North Carolina as well. But the big 6 that we'll talk about all the whole rest of the year: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and the state where Las Vegas is, whose name I never say because I can't say it correctly. If you look there, the polls are remarkably consistent. And in this new data from a Morning Consult and Bloomberg, which I'm vamping till it gets up, we'll have it up in a second, you see Joe Biden has a ceiling. In my looking at the battleground state polls, all I basically look at now is not the margin, Trump margin. I glance at it, not the Trump number, but the Biden number. And so here are the latest round of polls. And again, they're not identical to other data, public and private, that I've seen, but they're pretty close. Biden, 43, 42, 42, 43, 43, 41, 44. So nothing above 44, and basically in the low 40s, which is, of course, right around his approval rating. I'll leave those up for a second so people can grok them a little bit more, but take them down. Whit first, and then Mark. We talk a lot, and the Biden people talk a lot about the Biden ceiling, the Trump ceiling. But is it possible that in the battleground states, particularly, there's a Biden ceiling that is as important, or maybe more important, in thinking about what the outcome will be? Polls are not predictions, but these have been consistent. Whit, what do you think of that?
They've been very consistent, and the fact that Trump has a single-digit lead in all of these critical states is why I say he would win a landslide in the Electoral College if the election were held today. Trump does have a ceiling right around 46, 47, 48. He got 46% in 2016. He got 46.8% in 2020. So he's going to get his number. But the problem is that Biden got 51% of the vote overall in 2020, and he's slipped from that 21 down around 40. So it's Biden's weakness that has opened up this gap, not an increase in Trump's percentage of the vote. But right now, it looks like, that Joe Biden would have to add some 10 points or more to his job approval in order to get up in a range where he'd be competitive in these swing states.
So one more to you, and then Mark, I want you to talk about this notion of a potential Biden ceiling. If you were working for the Biden campaign and the candidate client said, do I have a ceiling? Like, it looks to me when you show me these polls that my ceiling's 43, 42, what would you say? Yes, you do, Mr. President, or no, you don't?
I would say it's time to step aside and let someone who's stronger take the Democratic mantle and try to beat Donald Trump.
Well, if he refused to do that, would you tell him it's possible for him to get his vote share up higher? Or again, is there a ceiling there that's lower than Trump's ceiling?
Something would have to change in order to get his vote ceiling up higher. And who knows what's going to happen between now and November to Donald Trump or to Joe Biden. But something would have to change fundamentally in order for him to end up being competitive in these swing states.
Okay. Mark, do you see, as I see in the data, currently at least a Biden ceiling that would be worrying to the reelect?
Well, I don't really consider it a ceiling. I mean, there's no question that Biden is not doing as well as we'd like. That's a fact, as well as I'd like. But when I think about a ceiling, I think about something that's not really movable, that's not dynamic. I think Biden's number is dynamic. It has been higher. It's now lower. It could be higher again. Trump's number is a hard ceiling, which is to say, I don't think it's going up very much from where it is. It might, but the second part, but it doesn't seem very likely that it's going up much from where it is. The second point here is that Joe Biden is the president of the United States. There are things he can do to improve his standing, whether it's policy, whether it's performance, whether it's whatever. But there are things he can do to improve his standing. It's hard to imagine what Donald Trump can really do to improve his standing. People know him. They either like him or they don't like him. Most people don't like him. And all he's doing is running for president. He's not doing anything day in, day out that actually affects people's lives the way a president is. So I think the president has more opportunity to move his number than Trump does. And I think that the ceiling is harder for Trump than it is for Biden. For Biden, it's a movable ceiling if there were such a thing. For Trump, I think it's sort of a hard ceiling.
Let me push back respectfully, Mark, on that. First of all, it seems to me, yes, things could happen that are good for Joe Biden, but things could happen bad for Joe Biden too. Israel could be bad.
We could have
immigration could be bad. Recession. But the point I want you to address is this. Based on data and spidey sense and reporting, I believe that if there is a Biden ceiling, and of course he has some ceiling, you posit it's higher than it is now, but it's a ceiling that could be raised. It may be because of doubts about his mental acuity and his age and his capacity to do the job. That to me is infecting his inability to get credit for the economy and other things, that there's some number of voters who just see it that way. And if he loses and he ends up with 44% of the popular vote in the battleground states, I think the exit polls will be clear that that's the reason, that in fact, he does have a ceiling that's lower than Trump's ultimately, because too many voters, I'm not saying this is definitely true, but as a theory of what might happen, that just too many voters just are not inclined to give him 4 more years because of his age and perceptions of his acuity. Is that a possibility?
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think the major thing that's holding Biden back at this point is exactly those doubts. But again, that's something over which he has not complete control by any stretch of the imagination, but he has some control, for good or for ill. And there are things he can do as president to resolve those doubts to some extent. He's never going to resolve them completely for everybody, but he can resolve those doubts to some extent for some people. There are things he can do that will make those doubts, will reinforce those doubts in a significant way. So that's one of the open questions about this election season.
Mark,
the problem. Go ahead, Whit.
I was going to say that the fundamental vulnerabilities of the Biden-Harris ticket are 2, and they can't do a damn thing about either one. The first is that simply the overwhelming majority of Americans think he's too old to be running again. And by November, he's not going to be any younger. He's not going to get any sharper mentally, and he's not getting more vigorous physically. And the second is that Kamala Harris is not viewed by almost anyone in either party as ready for prime time. And by November, she's not going to be any more ready for prime time. And I don't think there's anything this administration can do about either one of those 2 fundamental vulnerabilities. And those are the vulnerabilities that are holding him down.
Well, look,
and go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I disagree with you about the vice president. I think she's doing a great job, and I think she has the opportunity to show that off to people. It's hard when you're vice president because that vice before the title is limiting. But look, the reality is Donald Trump is also older and is clearly losing it. And that's something that we're going to see more of, and I think hear more about over the course of the next number of months. I mean, the guy couldn't remember his wife's name. Now, he's had a lot of them, so it may be more difficult for him than for some others. But the reality is that he's not so sharp. He's not so acute mentally. And that is on display. And the fact that he keeps talking about Biden's problems in this respect, I think only gives the press more reason to focus on his problems in that arena. And I think you'll see a lot more focus on Trump's problems in that arena.
Yeah, there's just a reality of where we are. And Jill Abramson, I'm going to call on you next, and William Cole and if other folks have questions. Wonderful opportunity to talk to Dr. Mellman, Dr. Ayres here. So please raise your hand and get you in the queue. There's no doubt, as Mark Mellman said, that people know Donald Trump. They're aware of who he is and what he's about. They also know Joe Biden and who he is and what he's about. And he's currently behind in all those battleground states. So that's just a reality that I think Democrats comfort themselves in some cases by saying everybody knows Trump. In the end, they're not going to vote for him. Well, right now, everybody knows them both, and one guy's ahead. Right. Jill Abramson, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say one word about that, Mark?
Yes, sir.
Say that, first of all, he's not ahead in every poll in every battleground state. So we should be clear.
Absolutely.
There are some differences, number one. Number two, I'm not saying that Joe Biden has a huge advantage, unlike some Democrats. I'm not saying Joe Biden has a huge advantage going into this election. I'm saying this is a very close, very even contest that could go either way. And that's where I'm
Absolutely.
starting from.
There's a phrase
Absolutely
for
agree.
there's a phrase for what Democrats are doing, Mark. It's called whistling past the graveyard.
All right. I know we're not going to get agreement on that between the two of you. Jill Abramson, question, comment, whatever you'd like.
Yeah,
Thank you
hi,
for joining.
hi everybody.
Hey,
I have a polling question slash comment, which is the most recent Gallup polls are showing that immigration is the #1 issue of concern to voters. And I posit the following. I think immigration is an issue that plays generally better for Trump than for Biden in real time. And I think it has the capacity to turn into a decisive factor in this election, because even I'm talking to you from liberal Massachusetts. Remember, don't blame us. We're from Massachusetts. But even here in towns like Dedham, Massachusetts, there is a giant backlash, an ugly one, but to me, an understandable one, to the flow of immigrants we've had sent from Texas that are a symptom of the border crisis, which has been just building totally out of hand. Biden has really not done anything. We're talking obviously on the day that Trump and Biden are both going to the border. But I forced myself to watch Trump's entire CPAC speech on Saturday. And he talked a ton about an issue he is calling immigrant crime. And I'm telling you, it was devastating. He's talking about, the murder in Atlanta, the murder in New York City and other places by immigrants living in these horrible shelter conditions. And to me, it seems to have the capacity of being the Willie Horton of 2024. And I wondered what you great pollsters, maybe I'm full of hogwash, but I wondered what you both made of the potential of immigration to be a giant factor in the election. And also, I think it creates a potential opening for Trump to increase his ceiling.
Jill, you're exactly right. Immigration, I would place right after Biden's age and Kamala Harris's ability as the greatest vulnerability of this administration. When people in Massachusetts are complaining about illegal immigration, it's a big deal. And just imagine what people in Arizona and Texas are complaining about these days. So yeah, it's an enormous vulnerability, and there is a widespread sense that illegal immigration is out of control and the Biden administration is incapable of doing anything about it. And that's a major problem for this administration.
Mark?
So, look, I think the possibilities for demagoguery on the issue of immigration are nearly endless, and for Trump, probably actually endless. But I think there are two limiting factors here. One is the Republicans killed immigration multiple times, but most recently killed an effort to crack down on illegal immigration. And that was, I think, a horrible mistake by Speaker Johnson and by Donald Trump. And I think it is going to come back to bite them in a serious way. We're now able to say, Democrats are now able to say that we had a bill that was strong, that was tough, that would have cracked down on illegal immigration, and Johnson and Trump killed it for purely partisan political reasons. That happens to comport well with the facts, but it's also, I think, an important argument that you're going to hear repeatedly. Second, Biden is president, as I said before, and he does have the opportunities to do things. So he is going to the border. And I don't know this directly, but I've read the coverage to suggest that he's going to do some things that will crack down on illegal immigration. So the fact is, he has the opportunity not to solve the problem, I don't think, not to make it go away completely, but he has the possibility of addressing it in a meaningful way, and I think that will help him.
Mark, would you be concerned if you were the president's pollster that if he does crack down, is perceived as cracking down on immigration in a quote you back meaningful way, that the base of the party could erode a little bit and his poll numbers would actually go down?
Look, I think it's something that has to be considered. I would be worried about that. But look, the reality is most Latino voters are concerned about, are not focused on, let me put this, are not focused on illegal immigration as their core issue. They have lots of other issues that they're concerned about at a much higher level. So depending on how one does it, if you join the demagoguery of Trump, you're going to, I think, he would find Biden would find himself in trouble. I don't think he's going to do that, but I think he's going to take some policy measures, some policy actions that crack down on illegal immigration without demagoguing the issue, without turning every immigrant into a source of evil in the country, which is what Trump has tried to do.
Let me say two things, and we're going to go to William Cole. And again, if others have questions for Mark and Whit, please raise your electronic hand. One is, of the last three Democratic presidents, the best triangulator was Bill Clinton. The second best was Barack Obama. Joe Biden is a distant third, in my view, as a triangulator, meaning if he did something tough on immigration, but didn't lose touch with the base, not just Hispanic voters, but liberals who don't want to see a deporter in chief or somebody cracking down. I've not seen him do that much in his career. He's tended to go left or right in more of a unidirectional way. Be curious to see if he can do it. In terms of immigration and Georgia, right, one of the 6 states that are going to decide the election where Whit lives, you see now one of the candidates talking about Laken Riley. One, I don't believe, has mentioned her. And you see Governor Kemp, no longtime ally of Donald Trump, or at least not recently, suddenly speaking like Donald Trump about immigration. This could go either way. This may end up not being decisive. But my sense right now is, and Whit, please confirm or deny, this is a big topic in Georgia, not just for MAGA Republicans, but for all Republicans, independents, and a lot of Democrats, in a way that could make that state harder for Joe Biden to win.
Mark, I used to live in Georgia. I now live in Northern Virginia, across the river from Washington. But I can tell you, regardless of where I live right now, it is a big deal in Georgia and is going to be at the very top of voters' decision-making come November.
Okay. William Cole, ask you to unmute and ask your question, make your comment for our two great guests here.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just briefly, I'm a defense attorney and a Biden voter, and I'm relieved that we're not going to have a trial before the election, because banking on a jury trial is crazy. I've been through too many of them. But leaving that aside, I'm curious about the polling on the primary elections. I had the impression that every time somebody said, like in South Carolina, he was going to win by 30 points, it turned into 20. And that seemed to be a pattern. I could be wrong, but is there a 10% diminution of Trump support between the polling and the primary results in general? And if so, who, unlike 2016, are there people embarrassed or frightened to admit they're not voting for Trump?
You're right that Trump has not performed as well at the ballot box as he did in the surveys. That's largely a function of trying to figure out what proportion of the GOP primary voters are going to be independents who can come into an open primary. That's one of the toughest jobs in polling, frankly, is guessing the proportion of non-party voters who will vote in open party primaries. And if you see polls that have missed, like particularly in New Hampshire, where independents or undeclareds can go either way, that's usually the reason is that the independents have turned out in a larger proportion in open primaries than were anticipated beforehand.
But what does that
And
mean
Mark,
for the November election?
Whit or Mark, do you have a view on whether that has implications for November?
Well, yeah, let me go back to the original question for a second. I'll get to that. And permit me to be a bit nerdy here for a second. But the reality is the surveys have been right on the Trump number. They've been off on the margin, but the margin counts the numbers twice. Poll numbers have a margin of error, and that margin of error exists independently on each number. That is the Trump number and the Haley number. And so the margin of error on the margin is twice the margin of error on the survey itself. So the reality is, if you look at the Trump number, it's been within a point or two of the average. If you throw out the outlier in each of these states that's gone so far, throw out the biggest outlier poll, and just look at the rest that are more like each other, that difference comes down to tenths of a point. So the reality is, it's not Trump that's doing less well than the polls say is. It's Haley that's doing better than the polls say she's doing, and those are not the same thing.
I'm getting tingly here, Mark talk pollster speak here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really
let me sum up for the people who aren't used to hearing such sophisticated polling talk necessarily of what Mark and Whit said. First, Whit made the point that the polls only is going to be as good as the ability of the pollster to try to game out who's going to turn out to vote. Okay, so if you think that there's going to be 25% contribution of the vote from independents and then it's 40%, the poll's not going to be accurate. Mark's point, if the polls have been showing Trump at 46, Trump's been getting 46. What's different is the margin, because Haley's been doing better. And that, again, I think, to go back for either of you to the original question, is there something in that reality that could pertain to the general election? For instance, are the battleground state polls we just looked at, are they assuming an electorate that is not going to be the electorate that actually votes, because they're not including independents who are going to be anti-Trump as opposed to independents who are pro-Trump, or some other difference? Or can we not say?
The point I'd make is this: I wouldn't count on the polls underestimating Donald Trump. Is it possible that they are, or they will? Yes, but nobody should count on that as a reality. Okay.
Thank you both. We're going to get back to the question Mr. Cole or the point he made about the juries when we finish our polling portion here. But let's get a couple more questions for Mark and Whit in before they need to go. Jordan, I'd ask you to unmute and question or comment for Mark and Whit.
Hi, thank you guys for your time. At the beginning of 2024, Catherine Herridge said on Face the Nation that she anticipated a black swan event happening this year. So whether another pandemic, a terrorist attack, but some kind of black swan event. Should that happen before Election Day, how do you think that could reshape the general election leading up to November?
70% of Americans are dreading a Trump-Biden rematch, 70%. That creates a measure of instability that makes this thing look a lot less stable than it has on the surface, because of exactly what you talked about, Jordan. I mean, who knows what's going to happen between now and November? But I will tell you that there's 70% of Americans who would love for something to happen to give us a choice other than a Biden-Trump rematch.
Mark, can you predict the unpredictable?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think by definition, black swan events are hard to predict. That's what makes them black swan events. So how likely is one? I couldn't begin to tell you. But things can happen. Things do happen. Sometimes very small things happen. Look, we're talking about Biden's health and so on. If Biden were to trip again on a stage, something that could happen to me or to you or to Whit or to anybody at any time, that could have a major impact on the race. So even very minor events that aren't black swans, aren't very significant events, even very minor events could have an impact on this race, depending on exactly what those events are.
I think we call those gray swans. Bruce Parks, unmute, please, and ask a question or comment.
Yeah, two questions. One question, one comment. I look at the immigration issue. I just think that that's a dumpster fire for the Democrats. I don't see how the Democrats could possibly navigate through that. I think that the anger that is out there it's just unbelievable. And I think as we see more people being killed by immigrants, I don't know how you overcome that. I mean, I just don't. And then the the question I'd like to raise is, and maybe it's a little off topic, I don't know, but I don't think that Joe Biden is going to make it through the election. I just don't believe that. Then the question becomes, all right, if not Biden, then who? And I'm sitting here in California with, Governor Newsom as our governor. I don't think that guy can carry the water. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Mark and Whit, let me slightly reframe it this way, since I believe it's possible, as we all know, he's immortal. Joe Biden may, for some reason, not end up being the nominee, but he certainly intends to be. Is there a way to think about the electorate and how they would react to somebody new, leaving aside whether it was Newsom or Whitmer or Harris or whoever it was? Is there a way to think about that as a matter of polling or the state of the electorate? Republicans all think, not all, but a lot of Republicans think there's no way it'll be Joe Biden because it's clear he can't beat Donald Trump. So when are they going to replace him and who are they going to replace him with? I spend my day telling them that's not the trajectory we're on. But do you have a sense, would Democratic voters, would independent voters welcome a different candidate given the doubts in some quarters about Joe Biden?
I'll let
I think it's
pollster answer that one.
Well, look, I think Biden will be the nominee. I think he will be the person that's running. And if he's not, on the one hand, you will find the issue that you were talking about before, Mark, of age and acuity being a very important factor. That will obviously be removed if by some chance Biden is removed from the picture. So that goes away. But who the successor would be is going to matter. There's no question, as Whit said, both these candidates have problems with the public. Some new candidate is going to be largely unknown to the public and will have the opportunity to shape an image for themselves. But the circumstances in which they come to that nomination will also matter here. And I don't want to delve into that too deeply because it's morbid, but the circumstances will matter as well.
Mark Mellman, thank you. Whit, thank you. I recommend Mark's column to you. It's almost always about polling, although not always, and it is as good as anything written on a regular or semi-regular basis to understand the true nature of polling, its limits and its possibilities. And so grateful to you both for making this much time to walk through all of that. Thank you. Hope you'll come back.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
See.
Thank you both. And Whit still lives south of the Mason-Dixon line, just to be clear. He may not live in Georgia.
That's true. That is true.
Still south of Mason-Dixon line. Thank you. All right, now we're going to talk for the last 18 minutes we have together about the Supreme Court. And I'll just say a few things, and then I'm going to throw it open to you. I see a bunch of people on here who I'd like to hear from, and I may call on some folks, but I'll just tell you my impressions. Merrick Garland is Jack Smith's boss, and it's clear that although Jack Smith won't say why he'd like the trial to go forward in Washington before the election, he wants the trial to go forward before the election because he wants to convict Donald Trump and stop him from winning. Now, I'm not sure conviction will stop him from winning, and I'm not sure, as Mr. Cole said, Counselor Cole said, I'm not sure that if there is a trial and there is a conviction that it will hurt, but I'm also not sure, as he said, that there'll be a conviction. But it's also pretty clear now that the soonest an election could be would be on the doorstep of the election, when early voting is going to be going on almost certainly in some places, and maybe through the election. The Justice Department policy, to me, would preclude this from going forward. I have long believed nothing about Donald Trump, nothing about what he did or didn't do, but just as a matter of democracy, the notion that the president's Justice Department was going to be prosecuting his opponent in the general election, what that says for our democracy, I think that's going to trouble a lot of Americans. I'll say it troubles me, leaving aside who the two people are. That's a super troubling thing. It's something that the Trump campaign is already talking about and will continue to talk about. As I said, I find it hard to believe that Garland is going to allow it to go forward, but maybe he will. I'll recycle my usual line about Merrick Garland and his political savvy. I say his political savvy makes Eric Holder look like Rahm Emanuel. And if you don't get that joke, I apologize. But the point is, he is not a politically savvy person. And this is one of the most complicated political decisions. History is going to record that he waited so long to bring this indictment, to bring in the special counsel, that he should have realized that the wheels of justice grind slowly. They grind even more slowly when you've got a billionaire paying a squadron of lawyers to slow everything down. And what the court did yesterday was, as I said earlier, was the middle ground but it's middle ground that works almost exclusively to Donald Trump's benefit. And even if Judge Shutkin and Jack Smith get this case back on track from the court, the soonest it could be, given Judge Shutkin's decision to allow for a lot of pretrial discovery and other pretrial motions to take place, the sooner this trial could take place is on the eve of the election, metaphorically the eve. And I just don't believe that in the end that that's possible politically, but we shall see. Throw it open to anybody. Raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment, ask a question. As I said, there's some great people on here who I'd like to hear from, but I'd love to hear from just folks who have questions or comments about any aspect of it. I've spent a lot of time since the court agreed to hear the case talking to people, so I can answer, I believe, a lot of the questions you might have, but I throw it open to any of you. If you've got a question, please raise your hand. I'm hoping somebody does. Otherwise, I'll go back to my filibuster. Jill, always there for us. Love to hear what you think.
Okay, sorry, I'm back, but
No, glad to have you back. So far, everyone else is being shy, so go
you
ahead.
made a comment in the intro, Mark, when you were just flashing that we were going to get to this topic after the polls, that, you know, some pundits and even some of the news coverage is suggesting that, you know, this is a wicked right-wing conspiracy.
Corruption, it says.
By the Supreme Court. And I just wanted to note that, you know, I was the executive editor of the Times and its Washington bureau chief, and I supervised the work of several Supreme Court reporters. And even one of the most liberal of those reporters just thinks that is rubbish, and is totally annoyed by the reflexive villainizing of the court by much of the press, especially Slate magazine if you want to look at their coverage, is like a prime example. You know, they're suggesting that the conservatives on the court are just a protection racket for Donald Trump. And this reporter just says it's ridiculous that on this case, and I don't want to, if I say a gender word, you'll figure out who it is. But this
you can go with they.
Okay, no, I don't use that. I just don't. But anyway, this reporter said both in yesterday's news and in the Colorado ruling to come that these justices are following the law. You know, their interpretations may be different, but they're well within the mainstream of legal reasoning, and that the press villainizing the conservatives constantly is just, in this reporter's mind, making it more difficult for the quote unquote reasonable conservatives in the majority, and that means all but Alito and Clarence Thomas, that it's making it really hard for them to just do the work and follow the law, that it's sort of a crippling thing to the Roberts Court. And I just wanted to throw that out as a counter narrative to the reflexive, it's villainous, it's a conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, I take your point. I heard from, and both on social media and directly to me, I've heard from serious people who have said this is corruption, that this was some clever move by particularly Scalia and Thomas to somehow make the case, Alito, sorry, to make the case go away. The strange thing to me is they implicitly sided with Smith in saying this needs to be handled on a fast track, and the only reason for that's the election, right? And yet they did that in a way that, you know, they could have gone a little bit faster, right? They could have set a more aggressive schedule for briefing and argument, and maybe they'll decide it in a day. But if they do what everybody assumes they're going to do now, which is stick to this briefing schedule, stick to the argument schedule, and decide it on the last day of the term, then they've split the baby into two irreconcilable parts. On the one hand, they say this is special. Smith is right implicitly. This needs to be decided before the election. And then they said, but the schedule we're going to do it on, knowing as they do that Judge Shutkin is going to allow for a lot of pretrial maneuvering, it's not going to be decided before the election, almost certainly. That's a strange thing to do, and they're not idiots. There's some of them are very politically smart. How they decided that was the right outcome when those two things are irreconcilable is a little strange to me. Couple hands up, Mr. Lyman. Ask you to unmute. Question or comment?
Yes, regarding the criminal cases against Trump, would it be politically wise for Biden to step up and say that he's instructing Merrick Garland to withdraw all of those, given the very rationales you described? And
yeah,
then the question is, if he did that, how would that impact? Would that be good for him, bad for him?
It's a great question. Obviously, it would impact the two state cases, the New York and Georgia. So those would proceed. Although the Georgia case, I think, is very unlikely for 1,001 reasons to happen before the election. But the New York case is in theory happening. I think that the base of the party would explode in anger if Joe Biden did that. Number one. Number two, it would violate something he says and believes, which is the president shouldn't be instructing the Justice Department about prosecutorial decisions on individual cases. And finally, he thinks Donald Trump should be in prison. So I don't think he would be inclined to do that. Would it help him politically? I doubt it. I think it's unknowable. It'd help him with some, but probably hurt him with more, would be my guess. Thank you for that question. Councillor Cole, I'm unmuting you again. Please share with us. The only reason I'm hesitating on muting you is you're not billing us by the hour for this, right? It's all free. All right, unmute. Go ahead. Share your wisdom. You're still muted. Try again.
There you go.
There you go.
The idea that us Biden voters are depending on a court verdict sometime in the fall is ridiculous. I mean, it's in the hands of the voters. A hung jury is entirely a possibility under these circumstances, and that would be portrayed as an acquittal by you know.
Absolutely.
And
If you were named. Yeah, go ahead.
Even if he's convicted, you're never convicted until the appeals are over with. And the idea that there's a 4-point swing nationally if he's convicted is just a trifle. It means nothing. The idea that we're going to depend upon proving that he's an insurrectionist beyond a reasonable doubt isn't proving it by preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not in the public realm, good enough to vote somebody down. Do you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, for God's sakes?
I tend to agree with you. Let me ask you this. If you were named special counsel to the special counsel, what would you tell Mr. Smith to do now? Not go back in time, but from here forward, what should he do?
Oh, I think that he's on the right track. He should just push forward and see if he can get this done. But, you know, he needs to, I'm sure he's well aware of the fact that he's going to have to try this case after the election. If the only... The fact is, it's really interesting that for once in history, a congressional committee has laid out the case. If people want to understand what the hell happened, they might look at all of these Republicans in the Justice Department in Arizona and Georgia who testified. I mean, it's already been proven in a way by a probability. A court verdict isn't going to mean anything. Should just go forward with an election. But Jack Smith has to go forward full tilt the way he has been. I don't see why he wouldn't.
Well, you've raised some of the risks of going forward before the election, that there could be a hung jury or an acquittal. Would there be? And again, I'm not advocating. I'm just asking you. Might it make sense for him to stop trying to get the election, the jury, a case to a jury before the election, and just basically back off and let Trump have his way and do it after?
No, you should never back off if you're an attorney in a trial setting. Backing off is not an option. But if he really would rather do it after the election, it looks like the court's going to accommodate that desire.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Robert Trotner, unmute, please. Question or comment?
Yes, I guess my question is, what are the prospects of Nikki Haley not endorsing Trump, even though she said she would, in the general election? Is that something that might be significant?
Yeah, I think she'll speak at the convention and endorse him, would be my guess, assuming Trump will let her speak at the convention. Look, she's been very poker-faced about why she's doing what she's doing next. I do think she's going to lose very badly on Super Tuesday. I was on TV this morning with John McLaughlin's brother, and he was a little poker-faced too about what he thought the results would be. But I think she's going to be wiped out every state very badly, and I think that's going to put her in a much weaker position than she would have been if she'd gotten out before or after Michigan. And I have no idea, and I don't know anyone who does that I speak to, what her play here is. If she wants to be part of the Republican Party, and she says she does, with the exception of Mitch McConnell, and Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, I don't see too many prominent Republicans who are not already on board or about to get on board the Trump train. And looking at her history, I think she will too. Not sure of it, but I think she will too. If she doesn't endorse, her approval rating amongst Republicans is not particularly good right now. But I think it would depend on how she spent her time. I don't think she'd endorse Joe Biden. I'm confident she wouldn't. But I don't know what she would do with her time between now and the election if she didn't endorse. So my base case is she endorses Donald Trump and speaks at the convention. And if she doesn't, I think the question you asked whether it would have an impact would be dependent on how she conducted herself and how much she rehabbed her image. Again, I may be wrong, but my spidey sense and my just recognition of history of what happens, she's about to get in territory of losing about 25 contests and not coming within hailing distance in any of them. And part of her rationale for staying in on Super Tuesday was there's a number of states that are more moderate, that are open primaries or semi-open primaries. And if she loses them all 80-20 or 70-30 or 65-35, again, I think how she's viewed by the press, which has been largely favorable to her, although I think surprisingly wrote her off after New Hampshire more than I thought they would. And how she's viewed by Republicans, how she's viewed by her donors. I think it's going to take some of the shine off if I'm right about what's going to happen on Tuesday. I don't see any more hands up, and we're close to time, and we always want to end on time. Tom Rogers, using the old-fashioned human hand. Tom, you're an attorney, aren't you?
I am. Just going back to the Supreme Court issue a minute.
Yes, sir.
I do believe it was an overt political act because they had a very easy way to take the case and decide issues which clearly are going to come up in multiple circuits, which is the rationale for them taking this and doing a full briefing, et cetera. They could have lifted the stay and taken the case, and we wouldn't be in a situation of this now a trial only being able to take place in sometime mid-August, early September at the earliest. And even if there is a Justice Department determination that that is not election interference, and I tend to agree with you that the Attorney General's overall cautious approach is unlikely to allow a trial to take place in that time frame, Donald Trump is not going to sit in a courtroom, and he will then be found in contempt as a criminal defendant, not showing up to his own trial, creating another appellate issue of whether his First Amendment rights are impeded as a candidate being forced to sit in a courtroom during the most important part of a presidential election, which will tie this thing up through the election. I don't see any conceivable basis that this goes to trial before the election on that basis.
Tom, you raise a ton of stuff I'd like to ask you about. This were Ted Koppel and Nightline in the 80s. I would warn our affiliates we're going to go over, but I never go over. But we're going to go over a minute because I want to follow up with you on two things. What makes you? Who were the conspirators and what was their goal?
I think the goal is clearly help them run out the clock. There was absolutely no. There had to be. I suppose. I don't know how the vote count would work on failing to lift the stay. I guess
Right.
you would have needed 5 votes to lift it, and there weren't 5 votes to lift the stay.
And why do they have to? Why can't, just as a matter of law, leaving the conspiracy accusation aside? Why does there have to be a stay?
There generally is, while something continues on an appeal that's fundamental to a trial going forward. But there's no absolute reason that they had to abide by that. They could have let all the pretrial discovery and other preparation issues go forward while
Right.
this was being decided, and not end up in a.
But that would have been that would have been not consistent with the notion of a conspiracy of a group that was conspiring to help Trump, and also would have been an extraordinary finger on the scale against Trump if they'd done that, given the norm of an appellate matter under review.
Either way, there's a finger on the scale here. Taking the case, I mean, they're not really expediting this. I mean, you know, late April oral argument followed by what will probably be at best a mid-May or late May decision, putting this trial into September. It just either way, they were putting their finger on the scale, and the issue is what public policy issues are served. There's a judicial policy to decide a critical constitutional case in their minds. There's a public interest in seeing the trial go forward. The two can be reconciled. They didn't decide to reconcile it, but no matter what at this point, Trump is not going to agree to sit in a courtroom while he's running for president in September. And if the trial judge decides to go forward, he's going to create a case that I think will actually benefit him. Because, as you say, I think political sympathies will lie in the direction of how can you make this guy sit in a courtroom when he should be out campaigning.
And just to be clear, your point of view, because again, I'm not. It's a common point of view that I've heard from many people already. You think the conspirators were so sophisticated that they gave the veneer of fast tracking by not just saying we'll hear it next year, so make it look like, yeah, we're trying to do our best to accommodate everybody here. But knowing that the appearance of fast tracking would not change the reality that a trial before the election is now extremely unlikely. Was that part of the conspirators' thinking to create the impression that they were fast tracking?
Absolutely. They knew exactly what the impact would be on the timetable here, and they knew exactly what they needed to say to sound as if they were not putting their finger on the scale.
I had one person who, very smart as you are, who agrees with you and says the only hope for the Republic is for Justice Kagan to have a press conference announcing and exposing the conspiracy. That'd be a good news event to cover if that happened.
Yeah, well, won't happen, but agree it would be a huge news event.
Yeah. All right. We did go over. I apologize for that, but I did want to hear from Tom and follow up with some of the stuff he said. Very grateful to you all. We'll have more, not just more two-way events soon, but a couple of announcements coming up, hopefully before too long, about the contours of two-way and how you can be involved. And very grateful to you all spending part of your morning with us. And Mark and Whit, still very grateful to them. And Jill, thank you for your participation, and the others who asked questions and made comments. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.